Okay, I think we'll get started. So welcome to this ESRC Festival of Social Science event. We're really pleased to be able to bring this webinar to you this evening from NINE DTP, the North East of England and Northern Ireland Doctoral Training Partnership. We're really pleased that some of our doctoral students are able to share their research with you this evening, and that this fits into the Festival of Social Science theme about my local community. And then we're going to emphasise a selection of research projects that really do have an impact on the areas in which we function as a doctoral training partnership. So my name's Professor Debbie Ryby. I am the Director of the Doctoral Training Partnership, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to some of our students this evening who are going to tell you about their research. So just to very briefly tell you a little bit about our Doctoral Training Partnership. So we are functioning in the North East of England and Northern Ireland, and we are funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. We are funded to provide doctoral training, so PhD level training in the broad social sciences across 7 academic institutions. At any one time, we fund approximately 180 PhD students who are all completing research on a very broad range of topics and subjects within the social sciences. So our students come from Durham University, Teesside University, Newcastle University, University of Sunderland, Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University, and Northumbria University. So we are very much spread throughout the northeast of England and over into Northern Ireland as well. Many of our students are completing their PhDs in collaboration and in partnerships with community groups or organisations outside of academia. And one of the really important elements of this sort of doctoral training is learning how to work in partnership with different groups. So it's really great that many of our students are working in collaboration, in partnership with different groups. And therefore the research is not only of academic benefit, but is of benefit to the communities that are involved in those projects and those organisations who are involved in the studies. And that's very much the case for some of the projects that we're going to hear about this evening. So we've got 6 PhD researchers who are going to be talking to you about their PhDs, their studies that they've been conducting over the last few years. They are at varying stages throughout their PhD studies. Some have just finished, some are in the final year or the second year of their PhDs. And therefore they are very much embedded in this research and what they're going to talk to you about this evening. We also have some of their collaborative partners joining us, and I'll introduce them later on in this session. We're really pleased that they're able to come along and join in this session this evening. Our aim is that each of the students is going to tell you about their project in about a 10-minute or so overview of the studies that they've been conducting and questions that they've been asking. We'll then have a panel discussion where we touch on the importance of this collaborative relationship and the impact that that can have for both partners. And if anybody has any questions, we'll try to answer them as we go along or at the end of the session as well. So if you do have any questions for any of our speakers today, I've enabled the Q&A tab. So please feel free to type in your questions into that tab. And what I'll do is I'll select any of them as we go along after the relevant talk, or we might pick up on some of them in the discussion at the end as well. So I think we'll get started with our first presentation. First of all, I'm going to stop sharing, sorry. First of all, we have Rachel Black, who's going to introduce us to her research studies. Rachel is a second-year PhD student at Queen's University Belfast. So I'll hand over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for that introduction. Good evening, everybody. And my research is looking at co-designing with children in Belfast. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Belfast, it is a city still scarred by its recent histories. Among the legacy of the Troubles are its peace walls, which are solid barriers erected to separate 2 divided and opposing communities at interface sites. The presence of these peace walls impacts the way in which children living in interface communities perceive their overall spaces, community and their city. And this is especially the case when remembering that the poorest neighbourhoods in Belfast continue to be those located in and around interfaces, which have in turn resulted in high levels of disadvantage, unemployment and high crime rates. In physical terms, the walls have resulted in duplicate play spaces such as muggas, parks, and even community centres at both sides of the communities, which just further encourages separation. And these walls are typically located at the edge of communities, which have leftover spaces, which are not really fully maintained, safe, or sightly. But because these spaces are so close to residential areas and are typically open, they tend to act as a natural area for children and young people to play in, meet up, and just to overall socialise. So the overall aim of this research is to explore the views of children aged 7 to 13 who live in interface localities facing deprivation in Belfast. It will analyse children's perception and usage of interface sites, how they are currently consulted as part of planning and regeneration processes, and how different consultation processes could be utilised to harness the creative potential of the younger generation in reimagining interface areas. And to do so, 4 community centres have been selected within Belfast, and these community centres are located within less than a mile of their nearest interface wall or boundary, and you can see this just highlighted on the map, the 4 outline of the community centres. So to engage the children, the Courtesan project was developed, and this is basically a 4-day-long workshop which encourages different arts and crafts activities along with teaching urban planning design techniques. So on the first day, it looks at mental mapping and emoji mapping, and then photo elicitation. On the second day, we look at analysing the photo elicitation activity through photo journeys, and then a brainstorming session. And on the third day, we look at making dream boxes and smart searching through the use of iPads, laptops, and iPhones. And then on the final day, we'll have the pizza presentations, which of course is the most fun part of the day for the children. And basically, it's important to acknowledge where this kind of influence for this project came from. And this really derived from working with the local community centre a few years longer than the rest have been on board. And working collaboratively with this local community centre really influenced this structure and the workshop programme, just to help enable children to express their voice on their local area and to engage them using different type of methods and techniques, which really just allows them to visualise their own kind of concepts and opinions about their own area to different stakeholders who are now willing to listen. So the community centre that was worked collaboratively with at the beginning was Grosvenor Community Centre, and it's located, we looked at a local site, it's located at the edge of the estate, and it's kind of separated by the West Link, which acts as a barrier separating both these communities. And this is a large space, and you can kind of see from the photos, you know, the scale of it and how unsightly it actually is. So looking at this site, the children are all extremely familiar with it. We developed the placemaking summer school, and this was the 4-day kind of pilot programme, which really influenced the rest of this research. And it looked at, the first day was just an overall consultation process with the kids, with using interactive screens, post-it notes, and the photo elicitation that was mentioned. Day 2 was just the overall site analysis. Day 3, there was a tour of Queen's University campus and a workshop on Photoshop within the Queen's labs. And then on the final day was presentations to stakeholders within Queen's. So on day 1, the children were really encouraged to think about the good things within their areas. And we just used simple tools like post-it notes, which are really cheap, and you know, everybody normally has them. So you can see some of the words that the children used to express the good things about their area on this particular site. It was dark and private, that could be their shelves, it was close to their house, it had potential, and you can go mental was always the favourite one. And these are some of the images that we get back from the camera exercise. And these are some of the images of the good things that lay within their area. And you can see they took photos of just simple things like paving, flowers, their friends, of course, and the rocks that they always like to hang out on. So then we moved on to the bad things, and you can see they used terms like really muddy, it was disgusting, unsafe, noise, pollution, and burned wood, and even fights. And of course, people throwing rocks off the bridge. And then these are some of the images that we got back from the photo elicitation on the bad picture exercise. And you can just see, you know, the amount of dereliction and damage done within this site. And it's probably quite shocking to even see these images and know the children still play within this site on a daily basis, but still increased during the summertime. So on the second day, students were encouraged to get involved in this project. And this was really just to kind of learn children more tools about planning and urban design, such as mapping, which really just encourages children, you know, to have more pride in what they're doing, as well as giving them that empowerment to look at tools and use them as a professional. And here they were developing their own legibility maps and mapping out their journeys within their own neighbourhood. So then we started the brainstorming session, and this was really encouraged that every idea was allowed, basically. So then they were starting to just say things that they would love to see within their area, and such things were coming up like lights, PlayStation, charging station, cups, gyms and sinks, just the most randomest terms. But it was really great because the children were just encouraged to think outside the box and just let their brains free flow with this exercise. And again, this is then we started the smart search activity, where we started actually trying to look at real life images of their ideas that they had, which really just allowed us to try to visualize it in a more realistic aspect. And then on the final day, these are just some images of the tour of Queen's University, which really just, it was such good to see the practice within the university in terms of, you know, the good public realm within and around, and just the positive use of street furniture. And then on this final day as well, this is just some images of the Photoshop exercise, where the children were then, these were some of the best practice images that they had already taken online, and they were starting to actually cut and paste and implement this within the local site. And you can see the element of water was quite a theme that was running in without them. And swimming pools are quite, you know, I don't know if we can get a swimming pool in the local site, but it was just interesting to see that water was something that they were quite, you know, wanting towards their local community. And of course, trampoline in the ground, outdoor gazebos, fire pits, and just something simple like colouring in the rocks. And these are just some more images of their ideas that they had. You know, they had a stage where they could have rehearsal spaces and speakers in the rocks as well, which I thought was an excellent idea. So then on this final day, they had presented then to some of the lecturers within the university, professors, and as well as students and the public. And this really just gave the children more power, more confidence in, you know, letting their voice be heard within their local community, and also just telling the people they are the experts within the local community. So it's best to hear from them how they feel about it, their own perception, and what they want to see within their area. So in terms of live site progress, this site has really been developing over a number of years, and having the involvement of the children within the Distillery Street focus group has really just allowed for a platform for them to really speak on their area. And the stakeholders have now started to listen, you know, on a larger scale. And over the years, some walls have been taken down, as well as some of the dilapidated fencing. And we've had some local members of the community now getting involved in terms of painting their graffiti, just to make the site more aesthetically pleasing, because it's now acknowledged how much of an asset this site is. And during this process, the children were encouraged to get involved in certain activities, such as the tree planting. But of course, with projects like this, and especially within a complex city like Belfast, it was great and there was so much positive momentum. But then when lockdown hit, you know, children and young people faced a lack of routine and loss of school and face-to-face support services. Then more children started using this space for play and outdoor pursuits. And it's important to acknowledge that this particular site is actually a local bonfire site, which has significantly decreased over the years. But due to lockdown, the pollen gathering have picked up a lot more, unfortunately. And this just really increased the risk for children. And unfortunately, even though there was so much positive around the site, the Distillery Street made local, regional and national news for the wrong reasons. But I suppose there was kind of, you know, a light around this issue, because it just really shared how much and how important it is for these sites to get developed and the actual need for them. So the positive outcome of this is that a feasibility study has now been undertaken on the site by Belfast City Council, and it is a really good contender for a suds park concept, which is really now bringing in the concept of water that the children had originally discussed. And not only has this happened, this nice site has been incorporated into the Fourth Meadow Community Greenway, which is a huge development that's due to be undertaken over the next few years, with the first stage starting next summer. And you can see the Distillery Streets down here. It was never included on that, but now the council has recognised, you know, how much potential this particular site has, and an asset it's going to be not only for the community but for the city, to be the first pilot of a suds park within the complete area. And basically, this is all just down to the involvement of the children and allowing their voices to be heard. And I think having the platform for the children to speak on their particular site locally, you know, it showed stakeholders that they need to listen. And this just really highlights the importance of doing social science research within local communities. And I look forward to kind of producing more results with the other community centres involved. And if anybody has any questions, advice and comments, I'm happy to answer them at the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rachel. That was absolutely fantastic. It's so nice to hear how those children are being able to get involved in the work that you're doing and really contribute and show that they're making an impact and that their voice is being heard, really importantly. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues as well about their voice and impact and that partnership later on in the panel discussion. But thank you, that was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
So next up, we are going to have Mark Ledger. Mark has recently finished his PhD at Durham University in the School of Education, and he's going to be focusing on schools in the North East this evening.
Hello everyone, my name is Mark Ledger and I will be talking to you about my PhD study and the implications for northern schools. Within the educational community, it is well established that attainment of northern pupils tends to be lower than attainment of southern pupils. This is primarily attributed to the affluence of the respective areas. However, since northern pupils also make less progress during their secondary education, government ministers and Ofsted have often concluded that northern schools are less effective and bear some of the responsibility for the difference in student scores. My analyses suggest that this interpretation will often be unfair. More specifically, they show that Progress 8, the government's measure of within-school progress, is unreliable and unjustly punishes schools with disadvantaged intakes. It is my hope that knowledge exchange events such as this one will help to raise awareness of these issues and the problems involved in interpreting value-added data. Before discussing my findings in greater detail, though, I'd like to provide some background information for those that don't specialise in this area. At present, Progress 8 is the government's headline indicator of secondary school performance. It is a form of value-added measure, which means that it evaluates the progress that students make whilst attending their secondary school. To be more precise, it compares the Key Stage 4 attainment of each pupil with the national average for pupils with the same Key Stage 2 prior attainment score. If pupils from a school perform better than expected, the school receives a positive rating, which implies that the school made a greater than average contribution to their students' learning. If students make less progress than expected, the school is considered to be ineffective. And this process can be seen here. So here, the blue dots represent the national attainment average for students at each prior attainment point. The yellow dots are 2 student scores. So student A would receive a positive rating of +10 because their Key Stage 4 attainment is 10 points higher than the average for students with that prior attainment. Student B would receive a negative rating of 10 because their rating is below the average. The important factor here, though, is that student B would receive the negative rating despite having a higher raw attainment than student A. The school score in this instance, assuming these are the only 2 pupils, would be 0, as this is the average of the 2 student scores. So the government evaluates performance in this way as the calculation controls for the most important external influence upon schools' attainment, the differences in student starting point. Progress 8 is therefore the only DfE measure that claims to provide an unbiased measure of school performance. However, both the validity and reliability of Progress 8 have been questioned, and the debates about its fairness remain unresolved. One of the major problems is that while the raw scores of each school are reasonably stable over time, the Progress 8 scores based upon them are more volatile. This lack of stability or distinctiveness doesn't prove that's a problem with the measure, but it is how measurement errors would manifest. There are also concerns that the ratings are too dependent upon students' raw attainment level, and therefore influenced by intake, just as raw attainment scores are. My thesis addressed these concerns using 3 different research approaches: a prediction analysis, several forms of regression, and a thought experiment. So, the first analysis performed 2 functions. It quantified the stability of schools' ratings, and it asked 182 school leaders to predict their school's score in advance. The assumption being that if Progress 8 ratings were valid, then school leaders' expert knowledge of their institutions should have helped to foresee a meaningful proportion of schools' scores. The accuracy of school leaders' predictions was therefore assessed and the implications considered. The second analysis investigated whether Progress 8 figures provide a fair measure of schools' performance. More specifically, it used a nationally representative sample of 125 schools, questionnaire and MPD data, and several forms of regression analysis to identify the factors that have the greatest influence upon schools' ratings. Theoretically, if Progress 8 provides a valid measure of school performance, then the most influential factors should be under schools' control. Finally, I conducted a thought experiment to assess the implications of there being inaccuracies in students' Key Stage 2 data. More specifically, I used the national attainment averages from 2019 to evaluate how a 10% measurement error in students' Key Stage 2 fine levels would impact upon students' progression scores. The magnitude of these inaccuracies was then compared to the error that would manifest if students' Key Stage 4 score were overstated by 10%. As anticipated, schools' performance ratings were volatile. In fact, the year-to-year change in school scores was so great that even if it was sufficient to invalidate some applications of the measure, irrespective of whether the differences reflect genuine variations in schools' effectiveness. The data suggests, for example, that Progress 8 ratings cannot help parents to select a secondary school for their child, as the school's current rating isn't likely to tell them anything about how their school will be performing in 6 years' time, when the child would sit their GCSE examinations. The remaining results indicate that the measure is imperfect and that a proportion of the variance was therefore spurious. As to the ability of progress leaders to predict Progress 8, whilst there is a reasonable correlation between school leaders' predictions and the 2018 ratings, which can be seen here, this didn't extend far beyond the effect of knowing the previous year's results. Sizable prediction errors were therefore common, and nearly 40% of school leaders were unable to say whether their school's results would improve, remain the same, or decline. Given the level of information that school leaders have at their disposal, this isn't a high success rate. The results also suggest that non-school factors had a high and distorting level of influence. In the most defensible multiple regression model, for instance, differences in school intake accounted for 44% of the variation in schools' results. These are external sources of bias that are likely to punish northern schools, which often have a higher than average proportion of disadvantaged students, and fewer students that speak English as an additional language. The same model also suggests that differences in schools' examination entries accounted for 12.5% of the variation in schools' 2018 scores and 20% of 2017 to 18 changes, which seems high, especially when one considers the percentage of variation explained by other non-school factors. Finally, my thought experiment demonstrated, sorry, there's a slide missing there. My thought experiment demonstrated that errors in students' Key Stage 2, my thought experiment demonstrated that errors within students' Key Stage 2 data tends to translate into far larger discrepancies in students' Key Stage 4 estimates, both in absolute terms and relative to their truths to Key Stage 2 score. Were students with an actual Key Stage 2 rating of 5.2 to receive a rating of 5.7, for example, this would manifest as a 19.5% error. This would imply that students had made far less progress than they actually did, roughly 2 GCSE points less progress per subject area, in fact. Since past research has shown that this type of measurement error will advantage schools with high attainment intakes and vice versa, this is a concerning revelation that has not been explored. In my view, the DfE's use of Progress 8 should therefore be reconsidered. The measure is not valid or reliable enough to be used in to make high-stakes decisions. It is too biased to provide a fair measure of schools' contribution, and too unstable to provide parents with dependable information about the effect of attending one school over another. These problems have the capacity to undermine the accountability system and any effect that has upon students' learning. Furthermore, when used in high-stakes situations, Progress 8 may discourage schools from admitting particular types of people or encourage them to find different ways of excluding pupils from examinations. Indeed, since Progress 8 was introduced, there's been a rise in pupil exclusion rates, and this is partly attributable to this effect. It's likewise been important to remember that progression scores also reflect upon teachers, so if disadvantaged schools get worse ratings, there's an incentive for effective teachers to move to advantaged schools, where their skill set would be recognised. All of these side effects would exacerbate existing social inequalities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark. That's fantastic, and really important potential implications of the work that you've completed as part of your PhD. So really fantastic for us to hear about this work, because it certainly has potential impact on our local communities involved in education. So really great work. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so we'll move on to our third presenter of the evening. Next up, we have Philippa Carter. Philippa is a final year student in her PhD in geography at Newcastle University, and she's going to be telling us about experiencing heritage landscapes.
I'm Philippa, and I am a final year student in geography at Newcastle University. So I'm just going to put a time on to make sure I've got my timings. My research examines the role of memory in shaping understanding of heritage landscapes. My collaborative partner is the Land of Oak and Iron Landscape Partnership Project, and I'm particularly focusing on how local people understand landscape as opposed to external people like tourists or visitors to the area. And I'm interested in how that works across generations, how memory is passed through generations within families and within communities. So the Land of Oak and Iron was a time-limited project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it ran from 2016 to 2020. It was a partnership project that included 3 local authorities, wildlife trusts, heritage organisations, and it was led by Groundwork North Eastern Cumbria, which is an environmental charity. Working in the Derwent Valley in North East England, it aimed to deliver a legacy of job creation, tourism, regeneration and economic benefits via the delivery of 14 interconnected heritage projects related to the 3 project themes of heritage, people and communities. It did this through things like woodland management, path creation, creation of a fish pass, archaeology projects, plus the community grant scheme. So it offered small grants to local organisations that wanted to do work with communities on heritage themes based within the project boundary. This is the area where the project was based. So you can see Newcastle is just up in the top corner there, and this is south of the river. So most of the project area was in Gateshead and County Durham, but there is Prudhoe up there in the Northumberland boundary, but mostly rural West Gateshead and going down into County Durham. You can see Consett at the bottom there is in County Durham. And a separate but connected project saw Groundwork also build a heritage centre at Winlayton Mill, which is marked on the map there. And there is still a heritage function to that centre, although it is a commercial enterprise. And there's also a charitable trust, which is a legacy group for the Landscape Partnership, so the heritage work of that continues. The heritage of the Land of Oak and Iron is primarily focused on industry. So since the late 1600s, the area has been a centre for metal industries and the coal mining and coke works that came along to service those metal industries essentially. And that continued until the late 20th century, with Consett Steelworks closing in the early 1980s and the coke works at Derwent, which is to the north of the area, closed in 1986, and they were really big employers in the area, so that had a big impact. And much of the natural heritage that's that enabled those industries to actually take place is what now attracts visitors and tourists to the area. So I'm interested in the fact that heritage landscapes are also local landscapes. For every designated site or listed building is an area that there are plenty of other things that mean a huge amount to local people or shape the ways that people see the landscape, but they don't necessarily register in these kind of large scale top-down heritage projects. So we could describe projects like the Land of Oak and Iron as top-down or official projects, and they tend to focus on designations, listings, tourism, economic benefits, and formal learning and volunteering. I'm interested in bottom-up or unofficial heritage, and I use the term heritage from below to describe this, which comes from Ian Robertson. This kind of heritage is ordinary. It's about everyday experiences. There's generally no economic or tourist impetus to it, and importantly, it's very much shaped by how people actually use place and the landscape as part of their everyday life. So Robertson refers to this as the meaningful landscape. And this is really key to understanding the relationship between place, memory and heritage as it's framed in my thesis. But I don't want to suggest that there is a neat split between those two kind of categories. It's a complex relationship between the two types of heritage. So in terms of capturing heritage from below, it's not an easy thing to do. Working with the Land of Oak and Iron was very useful. It got me into places. I met gatekeeper organisations, went to meetings with different groups, and through that I met people who wanted to be involved. And it wasn't easy to necessarily capture these types of feelings, and my methodology did evolve as the project progressed. So it wasn't an ethnographic study, but I tried to immerse myself in place as much as I could. I walked a lot in those places. I went to things like coffee mornings and social events. In the picture here, you can see I went to Chopwell Woodfest, which was part of the Land of Oak and Iron project. And I tested out kind of more creative methods as I went through doing mapping, and like this at the top is a card that I distributed to people and asked them to tell me about their favourite places and why they like them. So I started with static interviews, which are generally sitting in people's kitchen tables or in their living rooms, and asked them to tell me about their life story. And that would be the way I usually started. I used two case study villages, which were Chopwell and Winlayton, which you can see on the slide. People would often get to a point of talking about place where they kind of stumbled and they weren't able to articulate what they meant, or they felt like articulating why a place is special was difficult or just seemed too mundane to talk about. It was not worth really mentioning. So trying to push beyond this is what led me to do walk-in interviews. And this is what really unlocked some of the most useful material for me. So I asked people to take me on their favourite walk or the walk they do most often. And it was through this that I was able to really see, or not only just to see, but to experience for myself, how people use and experience place. And part of this is about giving power to the participant. They were the ones who led the walk, who set the agenda, and therefore to a certain extent they took some of the control. And I went on a few different types of walks. So I walked with dogs, I walked in places where people wanted to show me different plant and animal species that they like to see. This is what was the old ambulance track for Chopwell Pit at the top of the village that goes down to some woodland, and I walked with an intergenerational group there who spoke a lot about how that was used in the past, because the oldest person in that group, her husband had worked in the pit, which closed in the 60s. Walked a lot in woodland where people were much more able to talk about their experiences in the woodland and the changes through seasons, because they were their memories were sparked by walking. So why walk? Why did I choose to do that? And what did it bring to the study? So first of all, the physical experience of being in place gave a different sense of the community. There's a lot of kind of well-being elements to that, and being within the natural world, but the kind of links between the community and the landscape became really clear. And most importantly, it was about what is, not what is perceived. Obviously, there are different layers to that, and people perceive different things in place. In the same places, but it added a different layer of experience and understanding. In this particular location, the classed experience of place was really important. Obviously, there's a strong working class heritage in the area, and it really brought into focus the legacy of industry and the kind of all-encompassing nature of the way life was structured around industry in the past, which still has ripples and residues of how people live in the present. The physicality of industry, the proximity of work and leisure, and also the landscape as a place of action, not just in terms of work, but also in terms of sociability. I talk about this as places of encounter in the thesis. It's a more communal way of life, which has not entirely disappeared, but was definitely fundamentally changed by deindustrialisation. Heritage projects can sometimes unintentionally have the effect of making the past, in inverted commas, into something that feels very separate to the present. So we are invited to look back on the past from a distance as something that's gone and that we're no longer part of. And I think walking has a real power to break down some of that and give a greater sense of continuity. I think people are much more able to think of themselves as part of a continuum and think about what has changed gradually or what has continued, rather than a kind of dramatic change or a sudden change that people might feel more like that's what you want when you in an interview, you want an exciting story or a dramatic change. So even the kind of meditative act of walking encourages things like generational sharing, gradual change and renewal, seasonal cycles, these kind of themes and ideas to come through. I think it's democratic, it puts local people in focus and looks at how people actually use place on a day-to-day basis rather than how they think they use it or how they think they should use it. And for these reasons, it's future oriented. So by spending time in place and getting to know it well, people see themselves as part of a continuum that necessarily means they look to the future as well as to the past. So through exploring what people value in terms of using an experience in place on a day-to-day basis, we can get a sense of what people really value and what they want to take forward for the future. So I think the real challenge is in building this kind of work into heritage projects, those kind of more official top-down type heritage projects. And that's something that I'm thinking about more and more as I come to the end of my PhD, and that I'll be looking at doing in future work.
Thank you, Philippa. That's fantastic. That was a really great insight. And I must say, as a member of the community in the Derwent Valley, that very much being my back garden and where I walk the dog, I can imagine taking in that gorgeous scenery and discussing the key issues with you in an interview. So it's a lovely place to get outside and be able to explore that area, as well as taking part and informing the shaping of the heritage projects. It's great. Thank you. Really interesting work and lovely creative methods as well. Thank you, Philippa. So next we have Laura Maguire. Laura is a second year PhD student in anthropology at Durham University, and she's going to tell us about her PhD.
Hello, I'll just share my slides with you.
Thank you.
Have they shared okay?
Yep, excellent.
Fantastic. So thank you for the introduction. As you said, so I'm Laura and I'm a second year student at Durham in the anthropology department. And I've been conducting interviews and participant observation with community gardening organisers and attendees in the Northeast. In this presentation, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the perspectives of the organisers, and that's mostly from data through interviews. And there's been a really big increase in interest in community gardening in the past few years, and some of this relates to the promotion and framing of community gardening as something which might be able to improve health and well-being. So in this talk, I'm going to look at the perspectives of organisers and consider what their implications might be for these sorts of promotions and framings of community gardening. The community gardening involves the communal cultivation of plants, varying in form according to local contexts and the needs and desires of gardening spaces and local residents. It might be undertaken for a number of reasons, such as community development, health promotion, horticultural therapy, collective action and education. So there's a long history of the utilisation of green spaces to meet public health objectives, or to try to. One of the more recent instances of this is the expansion of green social prescribing, in which people participate in community gardening and other nature-based activities as a result of a referral or social prescription from a healthcare practitioner. As I've mentioned, community gardening and nature-based activities more broadly are often framed as something that might improve health, and there are a number of ideas about how this might happen. There's the idea that humans have an evolved and innate attraction to nature, that we naturally find it beneficial and relaxing. This is called the Biofuel Hypothesis. There's another idea that community gardening might encourage or promote what are often called positive health behaviours, such as physical activity or fruit and vegetable consumption. Community gardening is thought to encourage these behaviours and thought to lead to improvements in particular health outcomes. From what might be called a more relational perspective, in which we consider how a person's experiences, goals and subjectivities are influenced by their interactions in the past and in the present, their environment and with other beings. And from this perspective, we might consider how a person's experience of community gardening, and thus the benefits that they might get out of participation in community gardening, might be shaped by things like their past nature-based experiences, by the green cultural narratives that they're exposed to and adopt throughout their life course. So is gardening viewed as something that's good, valuable and attractive, beneficial? Is nature viewed this way too, or are these things viewed differently? Their experiences might be shaped by their needs, interests and abilities. And finally, their experiences by material affordances of different green spaces. So how do the social and material environments of particular green spaces make certain things possible? So now I'm going to move on to look at some of the themes that have emerged while I've been carrying out my research. And while gathering data and analysing it, I've been asking myself, what do these organisers think they're doing when they're doing community gardening? So how do they understand community gardening? How do they orient their practice? What do they hope to get out of it? And what do they hope to realise through it? These are the sort of questions that have guided me. The first theme is enabling encounters with nature, and that is through community gardening, the organisers tried to interact with nature and enable others to do so too. And they had quite broad and multifaceted conceptions of what nature is. Many saw nature as wise, clever and coherent. Nature was rhythmed, and they believed that there was value in trying to work alongside these rhythms and in harmony with these rhythms. Many saw nature as familiar, and they recounted stories of having engaged in gardening and other nature-based activities throughout their lives, often with parents, grandparents and friends. For a few of the organisers, their gardening was influenced by their religious beliefs, and some of them used the words nature and creation interchangeably, and they saw that gardening as having a spiritual component. Many of them saw nature as mistreated, and they believed that the relationship between humans and nature was broken or fractured, and they saw nature as requiring care. They saw community gardening as a small effort towards repairing this relationship for the mutual benefit of humans and nature. Well, clearly for the organisers, nature was something that was enjoyable and attractive. It held positive meanings for them. They were also aware that this wasn't the case for everybody. For example, when some of the younger participants of the people who joined in with the community gardening, when they entered their teenage years, nature and gardening sometimes became uncool and unattractive, and they'd stop coming along. For the parents of the younger attendees, gardening was something that was for children and not for them sometimes. The organisers were also aware that for different people and for different reasons, the gardens and other nature-based spaces are not always accessible. Certain people may struggle with particular aspects of these spaces and activities, like the cold, the physical exertion gardening can involve, the uneven terrain and various other aspects. So a significant amount of the organisers' work was trying to make these spaces and these activities more accessible, inclusive and attractive to different people with different needs and interests. So they tried to adapt these activities to these different needs, and also to try and encourage people to develop a more positive conception of nature, so to change the meanings that it had for people. And I'll just give you a moment to read the quotes that I've got there. So through the community gardening activities, the organisers tried to foster well-being. They felt that community gardening contributed towards a positive sense of well-being in themselves, and they tried to replicate this for others as well. They had broad and rich understandings of this term too. They thought that a variety of different aspects of community gardening contributed to well-being, such as the sense of stakeholdership in their local environment and community that it gave them, the sense of groundedness they felt through handling earth and through mixing with the earth, which had literal and metaphorical components to it. Many valued the opportunity that community gardening gave them for activity and for socialising, and some saw it as a way to promote social inclusion of excluded groups and to develop the skill sets of local residents. Many thus saw community gardening as working on what we often call the wider or non-medical determinants of health, albeit on quite a small scale. For some, community gardening was a form of activism or environmentalism or even civic duty, and many spoke of the desire to change what they called the wider systems in society that they perceived to be harmful. Many of these ideas were held at once by the same people, and many of them viewed community gardening as something that promoted well-being in what they called a holistic manner. And again, I'll just give you a second to read the quotes there. So I'll move on to consider some of the implications of some of these themes and understandings. So community gardening can clearly have a wide range of meanings and orientations for different people in different places. These meanings and orientations might not always neatly align with the orientations of healthcare professionals or with public health objectives. These meanings and orientations seem to both motivate and constitute some of the biopsychosocial benefits of community gardening for participants. And these benefits seem not to always be reducible to one or two isolated health behaviours or health outcomes. Realising the benefits of green space cannot always happen passively, and the organisers had to work, as I've mentioned, they had to work hard to make these gardens inclusive, accessible and attractive. The need for this sort of work seems to, if not contradict, then add a caveat to things like the Biofuel Hypothesis and complicates the idea of green space health benefits. Community gardening organisers often have a good understanding of the needs of local residents and the barriers that they might face in community gardening and nature-based activities. I'm going to end with more of a question than a conclusion, as my research is still ongoing. I've got 6 months left of field work. And that question is, how might community gardening spaces and activities change when they're funded and evaluated as a health practice, behaviour or activity? So what happens when these community gardening type activities are integrated with healthcare services? And I'm going to be looking at this specifically in relation to green social prescribing. So that's my final slide. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Laura. That was really interesting, and really interesting to think about the impact in a post-COVID world as well, and I guess during the COVID pandemic, and then as we're coming out and people are able to get back out and do things like gardening and well-being impacts, etc. So really interesting. Thank you. We have two more speakers this evening, and next up we have Lottie Rhodes. Lottie is a geography student at Newcastle, and she's going to be telling us about her research on period poverty in Newcastle.
Yes, thanks Debbie so much. Hi everyone, my name is Lottie. I'm in my final year of my PhD at Newcastle University, and I'm split between human geography and sociology. But today my talk looks at just one part of my PhD, which is supporting women in period poverty in Newcastle. So broadly, my PhD research looks at period poverty and menstrual inequality. What this means, it's the difficulty people experiencing in affording or accessing menstrual products. It is also understood as a poverty of education, rights, resources, and freedom from stigma for girls, women, and people who menstruate to manage their period. You can see on this slide here some of the recent mainstream media coverage about period poverty in the UK. So to explore this topic in depth, I researched the lived experiences of women in East End and West End Newcastle who have struggled to afford or get hold of menstrual products at various points in their lives. I did this through volunteering at a food bank and conducting 38 telephone interviews with local women. By looking at the lived experiences of women in Newcastle, I found that period poverty was being experienced by many women today and for many years previously over their lives. Not being able to afford period products and a lack of money was identified as the biggest barrier for most of my participants in affording period pads and tampons. This impacts local women's confidence, self-esteem, and everyday activities, including things like going shopping or going to the bank. So I focus my talk today on the support many women I spoke to received from a local women's organisation and food bank called East End Women. I volunteer at East End Women's Food Bank and was able, with their help, to interview many women who use the food bank services. Today, I highlight how important it is for that local organisations are there to support women in period poverty. So a little bit about East End Women first. East End Women is a community programme for women in Newcastle. One of its many amazing services includes an emergency COVID food bank that supports local women with food, toiletries, and menstrual products. Have a look at the photos on the slide where you can see the inside of the food bank, the sort of things that we give out. There's a bin bag of period products there. And also myself and Claire Vaughan, who we'll hear from later, on a trip to the local shop for food bank supplies last Christmas when demand was incredibly high with well over 150 food parcel recipients, including many families with children. On this slide, we also have quotes from two of my participants, Cassia and Kaylee, who both talked about how the food bank had provided them with menstrual products. So Kaylee said, I think that's one of the reasons why I had to get in touch with the food bank as well, because I didn't have any tampons. The people there are really kind and helpful, so they've really helped. So I'm just showing this because Kaylee shows that she got in touch with East End Women's Food Bank specifically because she did not have period products to manage her period with. And Cassia said, there was a time where I had no money whatsoever to buy these products for me and my daughter. It was horrible. And the food bank helped enormously with the period stuff and cleaning stuff for the house and everything. Cassia received period products for both herself and her daughter from the food bank. Now, Cassia and Kaylee are only two examples of many experiences that show how women are struggling to afford period products and that local organisations are evidently incredibly important services for women to get help. I interviewed both Cassia and Kaylee in November 2020, so a year ago, when we were in a national lockdown of various tiers. I believe we were in tier 4 in Newcastle at the time. And this just shows how recent these experiences are because they were only a year ago. Throughout my interviews, it was clear that the provision of period products was a huge help. Many older women had experienced period poverty since their youth, and only now did they feel somewhat secure and protected when on their period because the food bank could offer them products they otherwise could not afford. The importance of East End Women's Food Bank was echoed throughout the conversations that I had with all my participants. I remind you now that East End Women's Food Bank is a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And during the pandemic, there has been a huge rise of women struggling to afford menstrual products. I found that the women who had the help of the food bank were able to reflect on the improved situations they found themselves in now compared to earlier in their lives when period poverty was less recognised publicly and therefore support and free products was not available and just not deemed as necessary. So why does this research matter? Despite growing media coverage, there is practically no academic research about period poverty, who experiences it, and why they are experiencing it. My research illuminates the extent and severity of period poverty as a real issue for women in East and West End Newcastle today. But wider than that, there are many more local organisations around the country working to tackle period poverty, which shows just how widespread the issue is for women across the whole of the UK. But my particular research project shows how women's local everyday lives are affected by period poverty. My participants spoke about negative effects to their self-esteem, confidence, and daily activities. The women I spoke to were restricted in their everyday movements by the difficulties of affording period products. And sometimes many of the women didn't feel like they could leave the house because they didn't have any period products and had a fear of menstrual flow leaking. And finally, this research also highlights just how important local organisations are in supporting local women in period poverty and how well received this support is. This research helps us to ask the social, political and economic questions to better understand the structural causes of period poverty. So in my research, I'm asking things like, why are universal credit incomes not enough to afford menstrual products for women and their daughters? Why are menstrual products so expensive? What are the social, historical and cultural influences of why women feel ashamed by their periods? And how are these feelings exacerbated in period poverty? How can centralised funding support the vital work of local organisations fighting period poverty? And why is there appeared to be no government support or interest in fighting this widespread social issue? It is by asking these questions that we can begin to work to make impact for local women and local organisations through deeper evidence-based understandings of what it's like to be in period poverty and what some of the reasons for being in period poverty might be. So my take-home message for you today is that food banks and local organisations like East End Women are doing vital work to support local women in period poverty. They are very much picking up the slack of a weakened welfare state and slow government action. For example, when we saw universal credit income payments being quite slow when the lockdown hit, and just in Newcastle specifically, how local people are dealing with the legacy of deindustrialisation that continues and also quite severe austerity cuts in the local area. It is local organisations like East End Women that can make a big difference to local women. But they also need support to be able to continue their vital services. They need funding, resources, volunteers, and awareness raising of the work that they're doing and how it supports women and how well received that support is by women. Research like this helps to make an impact on a range of levels, including the local level for local women and local organisations that my research is doing, and also hopefully on a national wider level, such as policy change and hopefully centralised funding to tackle period poverty in the future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lottie. Really, really important questions that you're asking within your research and really impactful local impact as well. And we'll hear from you and Claire as well in a second after the next talk when we think about how that working in partnership is so important to this type of project. Thank you, really great. So we have one final talk this evening from Natalie Bamford. Natalie is a second-year PhD student at Newcastle University in the Department of Environmental Planning. Natalie, are you there?
Yes, sorry, I'm just trying to get this sorted.
Okay. Super, we can see your slides.
Sorry, my notes have just disappeared in the process of doing that. 1 minute, I'll just
If it helps you to present it that way without doing the full screen, that's absolutely fine.
okay. Right, is that up?
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Brilliant. So hi, I am doing my PhD on looking at embodied knowledge in walking as a representation of local knowledge. It's a cross-council funded PhD, which means that I am pulling from a lot of different disciplines when I start working on this. So if I dive in here, think about a route you walk regularly. Or picture yourself walking this route, or try to remember the last time you walked it. How did it feel? Can you remember anything specific? The last time you walked this route, did you have to think about it? Did you just think about each step of the journey, where to go next, or did your body just know where to go? These routes become habit. Our bodies remember where to go. The feel of the cobbles underfoot, the sounds of incoming traffic, the jump over the ever-gathering puddle. Through exposure to a city, citizens inherently know more about the fabric of the spaces within it. It is this bodily knowing that I am talking about when I refer to embodiment. To help narrow my research, I focus this idea with the activity of walking. Citizens often hold knowledge that they are not even aware of, and the challenge is to find ways to access this. On this slide, there are 2 previous projects I have worked on and plan to work on further. So on the left is a project I did where I drew imaginary directions or maps, and I took them to a starting place in the city, and I walked them with my GPS trace on. And I picked the starting places in the city as memories that I had. So for example, we've got the dirty church, and it sounds horrible, but it was a lovely anecdote that when my nan came to visit to see me try on my wedding dress, we were walking along and we walked past St. Thomas's Church opposite Haymarket, and she just said, "Oh, isn't that church dirty?" And then me and my mum just thought it was hilarious. And since my mum's moved to the northeast, whenever she asks for directions in the city centre, I always start with, "Well, you remember where the dirty church is? Well, you want to go from there and give her directions." So it's got kind of that memory tied to it, but also it's a very real place to her. So in a way, this is a map, but it's not a map that would mean the same to anyone else. It's not a map people could necessarily follow, but it is a map of true space. And then on the right is a project I did with some participants where I asked them to show me a route that they regularly walked. I didn't give them any parameters, but a lot of people did use Google Maps. And what I noticed is that they would put in the destination and they would put in the start point, but then they would alter the route that Google generates. So on the top, you can see the Google generated routes. And on the bottom, you can see what the participants submitted and where they've kind of tweaked it to the way that they actually work. And I find it really fascinating. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to follow up with these participants, but that's what I want to do going forward, is to follow up and say, well, why did you tweak this here? Why do you walk this way? Is there something like a good view, or is the other street a little bit smelly or poorly lit? And I think there's these little nuggets of knowledge that people have that you can kind of see in these 2 projects. So both these projects tap into the notion that we have internal maps of the spaces we use overlaid with subjective information. And it is this map that we use to make decisions about how we use a space. One of the easiest ways I've found to demonstrate this is to think about how you would give someone directions to your favorite bar, coffee shop, park, without giving them an address. So here are some examples of what that might look like. Before, we just used to search for directions in Google Maps. A map could be drawn on the back of a napkin, a beer mat, and it was much more common to do that. These types of maps are not accurate in the traditional sense, but reflective of a person's lived experience in the space. Scale is reflective of importance, superfluous information is removed, subjective contextual information is added. The stories that build these maps are the embodied knowledge I hope to dive into. So I'm doing multiple experiments throughout my PhD. This is one that I'm really excited to be doing. So I plan to issue this provocation, I guess is the best word, where I will invite people to direct me to their city in whatever way makes sense to them, no limits. Once I receive these directions, I will go into the city and follow them, whether that means walking a route, visiting key points, eating a specific food. As I am carrying this out, I will record my experience, making note of anything I learn via this, or how it may differ from my existing view or my pre-existing view of the city. The output, as shown on the next slide, will be a construct of a shared portrayal of Newcastle that takes on the various aspects of subjective experiences. So you can see here that there'd be the story or the direction as presented by the participant, my personal experience of enacting those directions, and then my interpretation of the participant's story in conversation with my own. And by bringing these three pieces of, well, I guess in a way you could say data, together, I'll be able to form a picture of a shared life world, which is a term often used in embodiment literature, about Newcastle. But why is this important? So currently, participation methods used for citizens to contribute towards changes made in their cities are often limited to consultation and regularly in response to something already proposed. But by developing methods to find out what citizens know about their cities, I can develop a way for citizens to contribute to changes in their cities before any plans are made. I want to develop methods that do not require participants to have additional knowledge, which they often need to participate in consultations, or to work in a way that's unfamiliar with them. I want to develop methods that just involve them giving directions or tracing a way they walk, ways that are already part of their everyday life. It should make sense to them and not just to the planning professionals. Using these methods, plans could be developed that fully respond to the needs of the people that actually use the space. That's me. Oh, lost my mouse.
Fantastic, thank you. Really interesting work there. Oh, sorry. Really interesting work there, and thinking about the importance of walking and sharing that knowledge as well. I can't, oh no, I can stop sharing your slides, hang on. There we go. So thank you very much to all of our presenters this evening. It's really fantastic to hear about the wide variety of research that's being conducted by PhD students in our doctoral training partnership, and really, really interesting and relevant to elements of involving the communities in different ways, obviously different communities based on different projects, and working with those communities to produce these variety, really wide variety of research projects for your doctoral theses. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A tab, and I'll go and have a look if there's any questions there in a second. But first of all, I wanted to come back. We've got two of our collaborative partners, no, not my collaborative partners of our students on the call. I was wondering whether Claire and Lottie, obviously you've been working really, really closely on your project, and I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how working together has enabled the project from the research side to be feasible and manageable and possible, and also from the non-academic side, from the charity side, how it's enabled you to sort of build, and what contribution the project's made from your side of things as well.
I don't know if you want to go first, Lottie, and sort of explain how you got in touch and stuff?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I got in touch with East End Women's Food Bank first off because I wanted to volunteer with the food bank because of the amazing work they were doing, and particularly in the COVID lockdown. And it was actually in sort of collaboration with Claire and working when I was talking about my PhD and my ideas, and because the pandemic had sort of disrupted my original PhD idea, which is completely different to what it ended up being. But I think working in collaboration, the most important thing, I think, reflecting back on it, was actually that it allowed me to find more appropriate methods for gathering data and hearing the stories of the women that I spoke to, because I was down on the ground in their sort of locality, and I was, for example, I was planning to just follow the crowds and do Zoom interviews because it just felt like that was the thing to do in the pandemic. And it actually became very clear talking with Claire, but also the other volunteers, other members of staff at the food bank and the local women, that actually Zoom was a completely, yes, pragmatic response to collecting data in a pandemic, but actually completely inappropriate for the women that I wanted to talk to. But they all had phones. So actually telephone interviews was the way forward. And I wouldn't have known that without working with Claire and the food bank as well. So that's probably my most important thing.
Yeah, and I guess from our perspective, so I should also say that I'm a part-time worker at the food bank and sort of the women's project, but also part-time researcher. And there's a couple of members of our team that sort of do some research or training to become researchers in their non sort of charity work time. So as an organisation, I guess we maybe make slightly more time than other people sort of do for research activities, but from our point of view, it's really important to be able to have that time to work with a researcher. So we get requests to provide participants really, really regularly, multiple times a week. We get emails. It could be from sort of professional researchers, it could be from local authorities, police crime commissioners, and then also students, PhD students, undergrads. So we're sort of inundated rather with these types of research requests. But when Lottie reached out, she did initially ask to become a volunteer, and then it was sort of a follow-up from that she mentioned her research, and being able to see that investment of time, and also so that we could get to know Lottie, understand how she understood the issue before we then sort of supported her to access our learners and our service users, is really important for us. And because I guess it's not that it's just about like the mutual exchange of time, but you have to have a lot of trust in someone before you're obviously going to introduce them to people. And often that's not the way that researchers will approach our organisation, don't really have that in mind. And so it's a bit of a win-win really. And also there's a lot of learning that can come from research that we don't necessarily have the time or capacity to do. So so it really makes sense for us to sort of get involved in this type of work and be able to support other researchers. And having done a PhD, I also know the pain of trying to approach gatekeepers and find people to speak to. So yeah, that was a factor as well.
That's great, thanks. And the really important messages there for all researchers about understanding that organisations might be bombarded, but actually it's about building that relationship so that you can co-produce together and work together for the most impactful research. So the importance on both sides, and yeah, totally appreciating that you get approaches all the time, and we as the research side might not see that. We think we're the only ones getting in touch with you, but actually, yeah, there's lots of people there fighting kind of for the same space really. It's about building the right relationships to be able to do that work.
Mm-hmm. And then, sorry, can I say one more quick thing that's just made me think of that? I think as well with the way that Lottie sort of spoke to us about the research is that she was open to hearing what we thought about the way that she was doing that research, whereas often somebody will just get in touch and say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I want to ask or offer, can we do it? Rather than saying, okay, you actually already work with this group of people, do you think that would be suitable? Might we be able to amend it in some ways? What would be helpful for you? So I think that's another important factor as well.
Yeah, it's really important in using your expertise. Yeah, it's great. Thank you. And we've also got Christina. Christina is the Centre Manager for the Grosvenor Community Centre in West Belfast. And you've been collaborating with Rachel on the fantastic work she's been doing with children. So I was going to ask you kind of the same question really about building that relationship and the bidirectionality of that relationship for both the project and the partnership.
Good evening, thanks Deborah. And if I move about a lot, we have sensor lighting in this room and it tends to knock off. So if you see me flailing, you know that's what it is. Well, I would reiterate a lot of Claire's points. And in terms of Rachel, I'll start by saying that Rachel understands the area really well. And honestly, in West Belfast, beside an interface, you need to understand the area really well. And the different views, I mean, even from one street to the next. And she had great empathy because you're going to be working with children from an area of deep disadvantage. We have really major health problems here, for instance, and still, unfortunately, relatively poor academic achievement rates. So it was key that Rachel was very much reflecting the needs of the children and young people. And that was the key selling point for us for the research. That it was looking to genuinely listen to our children because they're so frequently used as tick boxes. We are approached so often to contribute to surveys and research, and 90% of the time it literally feels like we've ticked off the interface area that has you know, deprivation. The research that Rachel has undertaken, it enabled us to look at an area strategy. I mean, you're so busy in the community sector just doing that, you lose sight of the bigger picture. You know, it's keeping the place going, and all those visions and hopes that we have can get lost by the wayside. So Rachel's work enabled that link to the children. It enabled a relook at a space that we have been really eager to change for decades now. And it allowed Rachel and the organisation and children at the time and the space to come together professionally and be listened to. And even some of the feedback that we were getting, maybe, I mean, it mightn't be in line with what my view for the site was, but it was in line with the children's view. So it actually made us challenge our own perceptions. So it's been super useful.
That's great. And Rachel, did you want to add anything from your side?
Thank you. Just the same position as well, Claire and Maddie. I think building up that rapport, it's so important, especially within research. And this programme has been going on with Grosvenor. Even it was this programme that influenced the PhD to go on a more deeper level across more areas, and just building up that rapport for so many years. You know, it showed that you weren't just doing that tick box exercise and coming in, engaging the kids and leaving. There was a genuine, you know, focus to actually implement some sort of change, and that hopes to continue on through the further research with the other community centres. But it is important to really build that rapport, and it does take a long time, but at the end it's worth it because you can, you know, make genuine change, which I think social research science is all about. So that's I've been enjoying doing it for so long, and I can't wait to continue doing it even further. So yay.
Great. Lots of support and enthusiasm there as well. And I was going to ask you a question actually, Rachel. Co-producing with children, all of the other projects have kind of involved adults and different communities, but yours involves co-production with children as part of your community being critical. How did you feel about that in terms of being very different to co-producing with adults? What did you learn from that experience, do you think?
It's so challenging, but it's so rewarding at the same time. You know, you don't want to give the children false hopes, and when they're coming up with these, you know, amazing ideas, you don't want to say yes, all this is going to happen, because it's not, unfortunately. So it's all about kind of maintaining that fine line. But the main thing I learned is that you need to keep the children happy and they need to have fun. You can't go in with this, you know, straight structure. You need to do all these tasks for me and I have to produce them. It has to be co-production, and it has to kind of free flow rather than go in with this set structure, because in the workshop structures, they never be the same. Each community centre has been unique in the process, and each child is also very unique in the process. So it's really, you have to monitor your working relationship with the children each time you're going in, because one day they mightn't be in the mood and the next day, you know, they're full of energy. So it's really about just maintaining that kind of empathy towards them and understanding their position, but also not putting too much stress on them in terms of getting your own research done. So it's about just keeping that balance between researcher and, you know, a human being, you know, trying to be empathetic towards them and their situation. So I think that's probably the main takeaway that I've learned.
It's great advice for everybody, I think, who wants to go out there and do co-producing research with children. I wanted to touch on a point that Rachel just raised, but actually is really relevant to several others of you. I know, I think Lottie mentioned this, I think Philippa mentioned this, and I think Laura may have mentioned this, about having to adapt your methodologies because you have a plan as a researcher. You're going to go out and do X, Y, or Z, and then you start engaging with your participants, the communities that you work with, and things have to change. You have to adapt what you're doing to be able to engage with those communities or collect data or get meaningful information from those communities. I was wondering if any of you wanted to make any comments about how you've adapted, or the biggest lesson you learned from kind of having to adapt to the needs of your community groups that you're involved with. Philippa?
I just wanted to say, in kind of following on from the previous conversation, I think the thing about longevity and making sure that it doesn't feel like parachuting in, taking information out of a place and then disappearing again. And part of the reason that it was kind of slightly by accident, in that I did my initial interviews with people and then I actually went on maternity leave and came back and did walk-in interviews afterwards. But actually something that I thought was going to be difficult and make the PhD more challenging was good, because it felt like a much more kind of like a better relationship with people that I was going back to after a long time, and they I think felt more valued in the sense of it was a more long-term thing. But again, I think I would definitely reiterate the managing expectations thing. It was really useful having the collaborative partner, but I had to be constantly saying, I don't work for them. Whatever you say, it is great, but I can't do it. All I can do is use it in the research and put it for, and hopefully raise awareness of it. But I have no power to do anything about it.
And would you do walking interviews again, and walking interviews the way forward?
Definitely, yeah. I think they're great. Yeah. I think when you're talking about place, I don't know why it didn't occur to me at the beginning that if you're talking about a place, you need to be in the place to talk about it. It's brought so much more richness to it, definitely.
And getting out into those literally into the communities to conduct the research is really valuable. Yeah. And Lottie, you mentioned about adapting. You realise Zoom interviews really weren't for that community, which I guess makes sense now you say it now, but when you think about it, but actually it's really important on the ground sort of thinking in terms of how to adapt to the needs of your groups.
Yeah, definitely. And I found that it wasn't, when I started volunteering, it wasn't actually until a few months later that sort of then developed into being able to do research in East End women, helping me get access to women to talk to, and like building that relationship with them. But I think that telephone interviews there's always a comparison between telephone interviews and face-to-face interviews, and the idea that face-to-face interviews are sort of the gold standard. And obviously in a pandemic, we couldn't do face-to-face interviews. So Zoom is a sort of replication of that and the gold standard. But there were several reasons that actually telephone interviews ended up being so much better. First off, my internet is not great and it cuts out a lot. And that's not great when you're having conversations about a sensitive topic like period poverty and periods, which are quite often perceived as embarrassing, and things like that. But also telephone interviews, I just found, working within a feminist methodology, and, I just found that the telephone gave my participants a lot more control about where, when, and how they did the interview. I think, I had, schools were shut, so most of their kids were at home. So there are so many interviews where there's like a child crying or a baby crying, but, that was just part of what life was like at that time. But then having their family around them, I feel like a lot of my participants could reflect more deeply about how their experiences of period poverty you know, and their daughters, and how sometimes they would go without period products because to give their daughters their period products, so they didn't have to go through it. And if the children hadn't been in that location, they might not have thought about that. But also, I just remember one of my participants sort of early on in the interview, we were just, you know, talking, getting to know each other, and then she was like, oh, hold on, let me just put my headphones in so I can continue cleaning the house. She was there Dettling the like kitchen surfaces. So I found that as an empowering method, and to not disrupt their everyday lives too much, I just found telephone interviews to be so much better. And I got I think my participants enjoyed that, and the sense of anonymity that they were able to get through that, talking about very sensitive and, you know, very personal things that we as women and people who menstruate are told, you know, don't talk about it, keep it silent, we don't want to hear about it, it's not, you don't talk about your period. It was very sort of refreshing for them to have this method where they could do it whenever they wanted, however they wanted, and, you know, if they wanted me to call them 10 minutes later, it was totally fine. So yeah, I thought that method, and learning that actually that method, it was only through volunteering at the food bank that I sort of like a light bulb went off, and I was like, actually, yeah, Zoom interviews aren't going to work, but they all have telephones, and this is what we need to do and move forward. So yeah.
Great, really, really useful. And you probably got much more naturalistic conversation where they felt capable and free to speak about such a sensitive issue than formally sitting in front of a laptop or anything like that on Zoom and being interviewed. Didn't you? Probably much more relaxed in what they were saying. So really important on the richness of the data you'll have as well.
Yeah, I agree.
And Laura, did you say, I had in my head, you said something about needing to adapt to your methods from original sort of plans to get the insights from your community gardeners, is that right?
I think how to phrase it. I didn't necessarily have to adapt my methods, but I do have experience of using a few different ones, as I did conduct some interviews during the pandemic. So
and is there any of those that you found most useful for allowing your participants to sort of express their thoughts and feelings about gardening?
I suppose I've been thinking recently about, I initially conducted interviews over Zoom. Sorry. Excuse me. I initially conducted interviews over Zoom, and it was actually part of my MA which led into this, and there was that. I had that idea of thinking that was less good than another form, perhaps in-person one would be better. But then looking back on that, now I'm planning interviews in person and in gardens and perhaps walking as well. I've now come to see the value of those sorts of interviews. So I think the boundedness of it, the clarity of it is perhaps better than some of the in-person interviews I've been trying to conduct. And I think people really appreciate that, the short duration of them, the clearness of when it begins and ends, and the clarity over what will be included in research and what won't. And I think, yeah, in that situation, your relationship with the participant is much more clear, whereas trying to insert interviews into ethnography in spaces that you're used to hanging out with a person, I think often it can be confusing when to do the interview and when to change your relationship from you being someone that hangs out with the person to you being someone that interviews that person. So yeah, I suppose the bounded Zoom interview can be beneficial, and as the telephone interview can be too.
Great, thank you. And all of you are doing really impactful work. All of the projects have the potential to really make an impact on knowledge and communities that are involved in your work. I was wondering if any of you have any examples yet. I know it might be too early for some, because some of you are only in the second year of your PhDs and they've still got work to do, etc. Have you got any examples of where community groups or organisations have taken up any of the insights that you've gained from your projects yet, or is this something still to evolve? Any of you?
I think with Grosvenor, because the Distillery Street focus group, I was able to join that group, and it involved so many different stakeholders and landowners of the site that we were actually looking at. And so the results from the placemaking summer school we were able to pass on and then create like a design strategy for the particular site, and it was titled the Branch Project. And that was basically for the community centre to use, you know, whenever they were having these meetings as well with a different amount of stakeholders. And I think that was able just to, you know, show the stakeholders this research has been going on, this is what the children are saying about this area, and this is their voice, and, you know, let it be heard. And I think that was quite, I hope it was quite useful, you know, for Grosvenor in terms of just being able, I think having, you know, the design strategies done up, you know, having so many different visuals, I think it was probably a bit useful in terms of Grosvenor itself, but I think Christina can touch on it.
Yeah, very much so, Rachel. And I have to be honest, when I was referencing like getting caught up in the doing, we do in the centre, and just with childcare and the youth provision, and the fact that the time out was taken to develop a design genuinely reflecting the focus groups and the children's views. I'm not over exaggerating when I say it has actually like parachuted us into the next level, and into the next feasibility study, and Distillery Street's kind of being, it's got legs now, and it feels within touching distance, and it's genuinely because we had the data and the design and the ideas sitting at hand. So thank you, Rachel.
It's brilliant. It's really great to see the evidence is starting to be used, and there's no better impact than evidence-based impact, I don't think, is there? So providing the evidence in these projects for communities or organisations to use that evidence in practice in the future is the best thing we can hope for, I think. That's great. Thank you, everybody. I think we will bring the session to a close now. But I really can't thank enough our presenters for this evening, and some of their collaborative partners as well who have been able to join us. We are hugely grateful to all of you for talking about your research. I've really enjoyed learning about what you're doing in your studies. They're so diverse, but there are so many overlapping themes and issues, and it's really great to see how these are coming through in all of your projects. Issues of hearing the voice of your communities, and slow project development, working with and co-producing and co-designing with your communities. Really important messages there, and you're going to have some fantastic results that will be hugely impactful for so many different groups. So big thanks to all of our presenters this evening, and thank you for your discussion at the end as well. Everybody who registered on Eventbrite for the session, and there were over 90 people who registered, we will get everybody a link sent out to them for the copy of the recording of the session, so that they can watch that if they wish to. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening. That's great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.